Welcome to the Samueletini Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to a new episode. Today, we are going to discuss again growth, environment, and we do it with somebody that is studied. He is also an academic. He was associated with Yale in Singapore. He's an author. He just published a book. He's trying to really focus on the environment, and he's also an educationist. So I'm really pleased to have here today Michael Maniates. Michael, it's such a pleasure to having you today.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you, Samuel. Thank you so much for having me.
Michael, you have a wonderful resume. I would see your story. You stayed in the emerging world in India. You have been at Yale in Singapore. Now you're sitting in Abu Dhabi. So we want to know a bit your story. How you have become, a leader in the sustainability space.
It's not a terribly interesting story. I grew up in the 70s. I was a kid in elementary school when the first Earth Day happened. And that, of course, as a young person, that was very arresting, sitting in the U.S. I went to Berkeley as an undergrad to study resource and environmental politics, and then found myself working with Friends of the Earth, the NGO Friends of the Earth, for a couple of years on energy issues. I went back to Berkeley for degrees in energy and resources, thinking I would stay in the NGO sector, and worked with Pacific Gas and Electric and City of San Francisco on energy issues for a while doing that. But I fell in love with the classroom, with just being with young people and just not preaching or trying to convert, but trying to open people's eyes and stimulate the creativity and the risk-taking and the experimentation that we need to solve the world's problems. And so I found myself in what in the United States we call liberal arts colleges. These are small colleges that focus on teaching, but also some research. And I did that for many years, became something of an expert in the design of these undergraduate environmental programs. And I was recruited by Yale then to go to Singapore in 2013 to help launch a liberal arts college there. Sadly, that came to an end in 2025, but in the meantime, my wife took a job here in Abu Dhabi at NYU as a librarian, and so we shifted here, and now I'm doing good work with the NGO, The Story of Stuff. And along the way, I've spent some time in India on small-scale renewable energy projects in the 80s. I have written several books, some for general audiences, and perhaps my biggest claim to fame is that for 10 years or more, I helped run the world's largest frozen yogurt shop in Berkeley, California, and it is still running. So, Samuel, the next time you're in Berkeley, send me a note, and I will arrange for a free yogurt with unlimited toppings for you.
Fantastic. That is wonderful. And then while there, you also become an author and you've wrote several books, and especially a lot on the limit sustainability that we have discussed a lot in this podcast. We had recently also Tim Jackson. We'll have others coming up. So your key point, what really struck me, is about consumption. So why this is let's say, the heart of the matter that is really important in this debate?
I came with colleagues to the consumption issue in the early 2000s and was part of a group of authors who came out with this book, the Confronting Consumption. And then those themes are extended in my latest book that has prompted our conversation today, The Living Green Myth. I think what we found back in the early 2000s, and it remains, I think, the case today to some extent, is that consumption is the issue you can't talk about. We were very good in environmentalism in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s about talking about population, right? There are too many people on the planet, and so this is a problem. And we were very good at talking about technology. We need sort of better technologies to generate more products at lower environmental impact. But we didn't really want to talk about consumption. That was sort of that was the third rail. That you don't want to touch that because that's too sensitive. And so for the last 20 years, I've been involved with colleagues in community programs and writing projects in course development around helping people get at this underexplored and perhaps somewhat dangerous topic of how much is enough and how do we think about consumption. What motivates my interest in this, and this is true, I think, for many others, is that we know that technological efficiencies, so-called green technologies, do little more than buy us time. They're not the solution. You can deploy a green technology, it reduces environmental impact, but then as consumption grows and there's more growth, any benefits of that green technology or that innovation get swamped by the environmental impact of increased growth. And so the key here is to recognize that in most but not all situations that escalating consumption past a certain point of comfort, more and more consumption doesn't lead to more happiness. It leads to flat happiness or maybe even reduced happiness. And this is because, after one has essential needs satisfied and there's security, and these are important aspects without a doubt. But once those are satisfied, then we find that additional consumption is status consumption for the most part. It's comparing yourself to others and then trying to gain status and secure that status by increasing your consumption. But of course, it's an arms race that can't be won, because I buy a nice laptop and then I see you have a great laptop, so I buy that laptop. Then a new laptop comes out and you buy it, and I'm feeling dissatisfied now with the laptop I have that isn't quite as good as yours, and it just keeps going. And so there's this opportunity here for us to ask a fundamental question, which is, how do we squeeze more prosperity out of less consumption? And there are a number of experiments and ideas that are bubbling around, things like addressing inequality. It turns out that highly unequal societies have this comparison arms race dynamic out of control. Thinking about perhaps substituting status goods for public goods. I mean, in some places, rather than driving the best and fanciest car, perhaps you just go to public transit. And when I lived in Singapore for 10 years or so, it became the case that the status good was riding public transit for many people, because it was just dumb to be driving a car on the island with high taxes and high fees. And many people have explored this idea of generating more leisure time for people, and instead of more work time, noting that under the condition that basic requirements or demands are met. And so Europe is a great example. Europe's GDP per person is lower than the US, but it is, and in general, for the most prosperous countries, but they don't have a lower quality of life. They've just chosen to take more leisure time, more vacations, more holidays, and less actual consumption. And so these kinds of social innovations need to be complementing the technological innovations, to be thinking about how, especially in the over-consuming world, we can get more happiness out of less consumption. Because for a large percentage of people on the planet, more consumption right now is not leading to more happiness, it's not leading to more security, it's not leading to more community, and it's not leading to more love. So what are we doing?
So no, thank you, Michael. And if I heard you correctly, of course, consumption is very difficult to discuss because it's the cornerstone, let's say, of capitalism. We need to consume, we need to produce, and we need to move. And I also like the more prosperity with less consumption. I agree with that. And one argument really struck me. So it's really, let's say, the sorts of decoupling theory that says, so now we can be able, with our innovation, with our capability, really to solve the environmental problem, to solve the so-called externalities, and keep consuming and keep growing. So in this, let's say, what we discussed maybe in some episode before this, religion of GDP and religion of growth. So how do you see that? I mean, how would you respond to that decoupling theory and that?
Well, I know that there are very smart and conscientious people out there who are working hard on this notion of absolute decoupling, this idea that we can grow our consumption and actually at the same time reduce environmental impact and have that be persistent. I just find that very difficult, though, to understand because of the second law of thermodynamics, which this is how the scene got set up for us. There are just certain physical laws that every time energy or materials change form, you're going to have some environmental impact. And so there have been great studies of circular economies, for example. I'm thinking of one that was done in Europe a couple of years ago by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that looked at the possibility of circularity for smartphones. Where you would sort of build smartphones so that the components could be reused or recycled, and you could develop this using the parts over and over again. And even under best case scenarios, what you find is about 20% of the pollution or the environmental disruption associated with smartphones production, that remains, no matter how smart you are with circularity. Because if you're recycling something, you may have to melt it down, and that creates a bit of pollution. Or if you're grinding something up to have it fit into a new product, that's creating some particulates. And so any kind of material activity is going to be creating what physicists would call entropy or disorder, but we can think of it as pollution. So I just find it very difficult to think about a future in which we continue to grow the material throughput in the economy without increasing this environmental disruption. We can get smarter about it, to be sure, but what we know from this notion called the Jevons paradox is when we get smarter and more efficient, that tends to actually be a driver of additional consumption, which then immediately, well, maybe not immediately, but soon enough swamps the gains. And so we got to look at these innovations as a way of buying time, of an opportunity to think about social innovations that match the technological innovations that are aimed at decoupling.
And thank you for that. I mean, it's a valid point. I really I understand because of course you always have some externalities if I heard you correctly. And now after your first book like about consumption in 2000, now you have just published a new book, The Living Green Myth. So and what you struck me one image that's we are trying to really put down fire, throwing teacups of water to our fire. When the arsonists, the problem, they're still throwing firewood to the fire. So can you walk through the central thesis of the book?
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. So this book, The Living Green Myth, is reacting to a story that we hear all over the world. I heard it in the small towns in India. I heard it in Singapore. I hear it loud and clear here in Abu Dhabi and certainly in the US. I hear it when I'm traveling in Europe. And this is the story that says that if you and I are concerned about environmental issues, that we can be powerful agents for change in the world if we live, if we buy green and if we live lean, if we buy eco products and we do what we can in our lifestyles to reduce our impact. And what I want to say in the book is that there are many great reasons to do that. It might be good for your health. By doing that, you might be building community. Perhaps you're supporting small entrepreneurs that you really like. Perhaps if you're in the environmental business, you have to do it to preserve your credibility. But if the aim behind these small gestures of environmental stewardship is to be part of transformative change, then that's what I'm calling the make-believe story, the con, the deception. It's there to appeal to our conscience. It's commodifying our anxieties to move products typically at higher price points. And the core argument really is a material one. It's a material argument that I came to reluctantly because for some time I was really captured by this green living myth that we are agents of transformation through our individual consumption choices. The most compelling, straightforward argument is that if you total up the environmental impact, I should say the good environmental consequences of all of the eco behaviors and products we are asked to purchase or subscribe to, if we add up all of that impact on the planet is so small compared to the enormity of the challenges we face, that in the image that you've reminded me of, that it's like bringing teacups of water to a large fire. I mean, sometimes you see these signs, every little bit helps. And gosh, I suppose if there's a raging fire and you bring a small thimble or teacup of water, I suppose that helps, but But really, I mean, perhaps one should be thinking of another way. And for your listeners who might be skeptical of that, I just urge them to go to the Global Footprint Network that does the ecological footprint calculator. This is the science-based, often revised calculator, and just do your very best, being the eco hero that you want to be or that you are, to choose consumption choices that lead to a better planet, and you will find that the impact is just negligible. And what impact does occur is often swamped then by increasing consumption elsewhere. And so there are other reasons to be skeptical about this story of transformation, but that's the primary one. Secondary ones are that it doesn't seem, this green consumption, to generate more civic action, nor does it generate a set of norms or values that appear to spread. As much as I and others might hope that to be the case, the empirical evidence is compelling to the contrary. So, if Samuel, I would say if buying green or living lean is something you like to do, like, do it. I mean, I still take my recycling out here in Abu Dhabi every day, and I know that it's not being recycled. It's going to the landfill. But it's a daily practice of mindful living that gives me some comfort and reminds me of the larger challenges in front of us. And so mindful living, protecting your family's health, building community, connecting with others, these are all great reasons for living green. But let us not fall victim to the transformation story. That's the living green myth that has so effectively piggybacked on products to get us to buy them. But it's ultimately deceptive, and it also diverts us from more effective and rewarding ways of acting on behalf of the planet.
And that is exactly, I mean, the closing sentence is exactly my subsequent question, because of course, some people will say, oh, wow, we had many discussions. Some people came and say, you vote with your consumption, you vote with what you buy. But of course, it's just a drop in the ocean. Sometimes it cannot be enough. So I want to ask you, which are the more effective solutions that we can deploy really to save our planet and also to increase our general well-being?
Yeah, that is the million euro, the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? Yeah. I think that what I can answer as a social scientist, I think what we know is that a preoccupation with this lifestyle environmentalism is disabling, that it tends to cultivate a theory of social change in our own heads that says that we have to get everybody on board with these small choices because we are seduced by the story that if we can get everybody doing these small choices, the cumulative impact will be sufficient to make a difference. Well, we know materially the cumulative impact won't make a difference. But what perhaps may be more insidious is this spread of this view of social change that says, wow, I want to make change. I'm concerned about the planet. I want to be a difference maker. Let me consume green and pester or nag or cajole all of my friends, or shame all of my friends to try to do the same. So we get this critical mass of consumption, green consumption. And what we know is that that approach, that model doesn't work. The green consumption isn't significant materially. You rarely get more than 15 or 20% on board. And most importantly, it is so debilitating. When you think you have to get everybody on board, this is a pathway to cynicism and despair because you don't, and then you come to conclude that people don't care, and then you become cynical, and you're just not much fun to be around, which is why I titled one of the chapters in my book, Why Environmentalists Don't Get Invited to Parties. Because when you sort of have this view that the best way to save the day is through lifestyle change, you end up becoming rather judgmental and perhaps guilty yourself that you're not measuring up fully. And so the alternative model here is nothing new. It says that what we need to be thinking about is how to join with others around issues that we most care about: food, water, energy, waste, in our communities. And then how can we network with others outside of our community to explore ways of changing the structures within which we live? So one place in the book, I make the claim that really we focus too much on the mouse. It's, our values. Are we educated enough? Are we doing the right thing environmentally? When really we need to be thinking about the maze. How can we shift the configuration of everyday life so that behaving sustainably becomes as natural as falling off a log, that we do it without thinking? When I was in Singapore, we didn't have a car because mass transit was available and the cost of a car because of taxes and fees was very high. I didn't drive a car for 12 years. I was fine with that. But was it because I suddenly had an environmental realization that automobility as currently constructed is bad? No. I was in an environment that just structured not driving a car. So the model I would suggest would be one that asks people to be heartened by the fact that it only takes 10 to 15% of the population to drive change. It doesn't take large majorities. And then to identify issues that one feels passionate about and you take joy from working on it, learn more about that issue, connect with others, and embrace a bold experimentalism in the process of trying to identify places and ways where one can change the everyday fabric of life. So that rather than nagging at people, people just find themselves in an environment where it is natural to do the right thing. That can be something as simple as having more organic food available at the markets at an affordable price. It could be providing better transportation. In the US, in Europe, we're seeing a push now to more reusability, where you buy reusable containers and then return them. These are structures that make behaving with a lower environmental footprint more natural. We need to be doing much more of this, but we need to have 1,000 flowers bloom. And I think that comes from the innate creativity that we have as people who care about the planet working with others.
I like the way that you make sustainability something natural. We focus a lot on the, let's say, what we need to do, whatever, but not on the systems. So if I hear correctly, that is your, let's say, thesis. I want to launch you a provocation. So some people would say, yeah, fantastic, Michael. That is very good. We like it. But if we don't do that, I mean, if you take out agency out of the person of the individual, I mean, how would you respond? Is it just inaction? Is it bringing us to inaction or cynism? Or worst, you end up, bolstering the people that they don't want to save the planet.
This has been a struggle for me to try to think about how to productively share my perspective on the living green myth without people feeling disempowered. I think the conclusion that I've reached is that, and this is the title of the first chapter in my book. The title is Five Guys in a Room. I suggest that I don't think there are five people in a room who are conspiring to disempower us. But if there were, they would be coming up with this living green myth that says that we save the planet by buying green. My sense is that this myth is actually a way of parking the environmentally conscientious into cul-de-sacs of irrelevance and despair. And so this question of personal agency, I think my counter would be buying green and living lean to change the world is a false agency. It's that the perception is that we are making a difference, but we are being told a false story. What I encourage people to do is to continue to do those green living behaviors that bring them joy. Just do the ones that give you joy, not the ones you feel you have to do because you have to save the planet. And take energy from that in a way then that helps you explore other avenues of agency as a citizen rather than as a consumer. I mentioned in the first question you asked about my personal history that I came up during the kind of Earth Day period. I was an undergraduate at Berkeley in 1975 to 79. And back then, and I hate to sound like an older guy, but back then, before the internet, the idea of green living was you just figured out ways of working with your friends and neighbors to be a citizen. And being a citizen didn't mean protesting necessarily or raising a ruckus, but it meant finding ways of working in common for the common good to shift regulations or structures or create more opportunities for a natural sustainability. So my sense is this: we just need to return to those days of the 70s and 80s where most of the environmental regulations and norms that we still point back to as being innovative, they came about at a time when green living was a moment where we discovered our agency by collectively thinking about problems and solving them. And I should say before I end, I don't want to romanticize this collective action. I mean, we have all been in meetings, haven't we, Samuel, where they are just awful and ponderous, or we've worked in groups where we say, "Oh my God, can I please get out of the room?" So there are always challenges in working collectively. But what we know, again, as social scientists who study this, is that far more inner joy and self-confidence and a sense of personal reward, it comes from working collectively. That these individual acts of green consumption, of screwing in a light bulb or buying a more energy efficient appliance, while that can be good in the short run, it doesn't give us what political scientists call solidarity effects that are what sustains us. Working in a group for something better is really what can sustain us over time. And so if you're in a group working for something better and there are some annoying people in that group who are making your life miserable, well, either figure out a way to do an end run around that, or just go out and form a new group or a new set of connections. It's easier now than it was when I was a kid, of course, because of the interconnectivity. And there are so many possibilities that we miss if we're focused on saving the world one green choice at a time.
And thank you for that. And a second provocation, you say less consumption, less grow, all this discussion. And sometimes this lands where I sit as, let's say, a Western world, so developed world meet or wonderful say. So you say, how do you respond with the global South that say more consumption? It's actually what we need, what we want, especially for many countries that are still even below poverty line. So how these two models can work together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I became really sensitized to this issue during my days in the 80s in India doing renewable energy technologies. And then my first education job was in the Appalachian region in Virginia, quite impoverished area. And so when you have some young white university kid waving his arms talking about reduced consumption, of course, it lands as something that is, if not tone deaf, just completely kind of insulting. So I take a page from some of my colleagues in thinking about the consumption issue, not so much as Africa versus the US or the UK versus Kenya, but rather in thinking about consumption classes, the so-called overconsumers who are consuming it at heightened luxury levels and are actually disproportionately accountable for the environmental damage. The middle consumers across the world who are consuming at more or less sustainable levels, and then the low consumers who are in poverty. And what we've seen over the last 25 years or so, and again, we know this empirically from great social science research, is that middle consumer category has, because of forces of globalization, capitalism, growing inequality, that middle consumer category has shrunk in size globally, and you're seeing then a growth in over consumers and under consumers. And why I say that perhaps the geographic analysis or frame isn't useful, Kenya versus UK, for instance, is that we have over consumers and under consumers and middle consumers in every country. So the elite in Nairobi are probably vacationing in the same places as the elite from London, right? They're buying the same products. They're motivated by the same advertisements. They aspire to the same life. So when we're talking about consumption, we need to be, so sensitive to these consumption classes that spread transnationally and to be thinking about what kinds of interventions can in particular target the overconsumption class in order to shrink that impact and grow the middle consumption class while shrinking that lower consumption class. And now there is some geographic elements to that. Of course, there are some places that have higher concentrations. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that we need growth, material growth for much of the world's poor in order to lift them out of poverty. The trick is to ask what kind of growth globally can we afford and what kind of growth is foolish growth in terms of environmental impact, and begin to think about models and processes for digging at that. Colleagues and I released a book about 4 years ago called Consumption Corridors. It's available off my website and it's free to download. And that book asks, how would we think about consumption if we want the good life for everybody, including the world's poor? And the argument in that book is that we need to be thinking geographically specific around lower minimum levels of consumption and maximum levels of consumption, and do that simultaneously. And that helps us then deal with this class of low consumers, or under consumers is actually what they're referred to as, well, also attacking the overconsumption problem. So we always have to keep the poor of the world in mind. They cannot be made the victims of any effort to bring the planet destroying overconsumption under control.
No, thank you for that. I think I really like the consumption class, which is clustered differently. And of course, it's more complex than just black and white, and really just one geography against the other. But it's really maybe elites and people that consume status and others, notwithstanding their geographical location, and people that they have less. And this is very, very important. I want to throw a very quick provocation before going to the last questions. I really like some people, let's say a very conservative person would say, yes, Michael, fantastic. But on the other side, you are limiting my freedom. I mean, I'm thinking about the MAGA maybe in the US and others. Say, Michael, I mean, you are limiting my freedom. Why I should not consume? How would you respond to that quest, to that critic that's coming from the right?
It's a criticism that is often leveled not just at proponents of addressing consumption, but the environmental community, I think, more generally. I think that the trick here, I don't want to diminish it by calling it trick. The approach needs, in my view, to move radically away from the finger wagging and prescriptions that have been an unfortunate component of much of mainstream environmentalism over the last 30 years. It's true that when the initial push towards green consumption as a way to solve the problems, which, at least from my vantage point, is a recent phenomenon, it really takes root in the early 1990s, that most of what we were asked to do in the 90s, and perhaps even today, tended to disadvantage poor households, and in particularly women who might shoulder an unjust burden of domestic care. So, for instance, the call to move away from disposable diapers and to cloth diapers. Well, there's some materiality suspicion going on there. I'm not clear really what is better, but let's just say cloth diapers are better. But that creates a financial burden on the poor to buy those diapers initially, at least in one fell swoop. But more importantly, it increases sort of domestic sort of labor. And so much of what has happened around environmentalism, I think, has ignored the fault lines in society. So, Samuel, I would return to my opening thesis that it's the maze, not the mouse. That if we want people to be thinking about acting more sustainably, then we need to meet them where they are. I am struck by Samuel Harrington's advice. Samuel Harrington was the founder of the Democratic Socialist of America back in the late 60s. And he said, you have to go to where people are and then gently bring them along to where you want them to be. And in this case, many people on the right are appropriately suspicious of elites coming in and telling them, how to run their lives. I would be as well. But there are potential connections. Many people on the right are concerned about the erosion of community or the loss of economic stability, or or the decline in necessary public services. And there is a place to have a conversation about ways in which different forms of consumption, or perhaps different structures that would help us get by or live a great life without having to consume so much. I think there are some important resonance points. But your point is very well taken, and thank you for raising it. The moment any of this becomes some version of "I know better than you do, so do it my way," then I think that we are in trouble. Whereas, instead, if you have situations where you say we're creating some new opportunities to behave differently, then we find that oftentimes people will move in that direction.
Instead of, if you point fingers and you start the bridging the divide more rather than bringing togetherness, and then because I always think there is more that unite than divide us, you undermine rather than reinforce your mission. And the third point for me, it's the last question before our closing, is you have been in education, you've been at Yale in Singapore for many years, you have designed many courses. We know that sustainability it's important, saving the planet is important, and we know that younger generation they have better chances to change their behavior than older generation, which is always the case. So what needs to be done? Which is your recipe for the education side?
Let me respectfully and gently resist the recipe sort of part, because I think all of this is so experimental, right? We live in these dynamic systems, right, where openings emerge. But in this current book that I'm working on, I want to suggest that the higher education took the lead on sustainability issues in the 80s. It's happened particularly in the US and Europe, and then moved around the world with a focus on climate change. And so in the 80s, we had in the US the president's climate commitment, where colleges and universities would sign on to meet climate neutrality targets. And this led to the important and early adoption of renewable energy technologies and advanced energy efficiency approaches. And that was great. That got that market going and running, and it normalized the use of renewable energy, not just for universities, but for other entities, governments, corporations. So this was an institutional kind of norm shift. Fabulous. But my view is that the educational system now remains sort of stuck in that. In some ways, they're like the individual consumer, thinking that if they just buy more green products, that's going to drive change. And that was important early on to begin to develop those technologies and mature those markets. But now that much of that has been developed and matured, my view is that the university system must sort of move beyond that approach to sustainability. And that would include, for example, training people to be able to think more critically and creatively about processes of social change. One of my great concerns as an educator in this field for more years than I care to remember is that we don't do a very good job of helping students think about the different theories, if I may say, or ideas about how social change happens, so that then they can select among those theories or combine those theories as they go out into the world to make change. Instead, we either don't talk about it at all, especially in environmental courses, which is, I think, one reason why this living green myth has been able to take such root, or students are left with the latest the theory of change they heard in their most recent course. If their most recent course was economics, it was get the prices right. If it was political science, it would be get stakeholders involved. So one of the things we need to do if we want to help activate that 15 or 20% that's going to make a difference on our planet is we need to equip them to be able to think creatively about collaborative theories of change. We're not doing that, Samuel. This I think is the great scandal in higher education around environmental issues. And I use scandal intentionally. I don't think there's a single actor doing that. I think we as educators either aren't equipped or for some reason we're shy about that. Higher education can also be helping people think about these paths to high prosperity, low consumption ways of living. We're not doing much of that right now. Most of the university education seems to be sort of technocratic in nature. And we can also be thinking about resilience studies. How can we help students be useful parts of their community to foster resilience in the face of, let's face it, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. The resilience in the face of some of the challenges before us. The thing that scares me most about the environmental challenges on our plate, and they're coming, the thing that scares me most is not the actual environmental challenges, more drought, increased floods, food prices going up. As difficult as that is, what frightens me is how we will respond to them. Because the history of human societies is that often when we're under pressure, the worst angels of our nature emerge. We fold into in-groups and out-groups, and there's conflict. And what we really need is an educational structure that supports the best angels of our nature, so that when these challenges emerge, we see that as an opportunity to work collectively to create something better, as opposed to work in small groups scrambling for the few crumbs that might remain on the table. Higher education has got to take up the challenge for that.
And thank you, Michael, for sharing this perspective. And it's really interesting. I really like how you frame it. And as a closing question, as a message for our audience, because sometimes people they're listening to us all over the planet, you say, okay, Michael, I mean, a lot of food for thoughts. I mean, sometimes maybe you have challenged our beliefs, you have challenged but at the end of the day, Michael, what we can do? What is a message you want to leave to them?
I close my book with a metaphor from a futurist, environmental futurist, Buckminster Fuller, who talked about trim tabs as an appropriate social metaphor. Trim tabs are the small little tabs on larger rudders that steer airplanes and ships, other large vessels. And what Buckminster Fuller was arguing back in the 70s, and of course many other people have taken that up, is that we should be taking a trim tab approach to solving the community problems and the global problems around us, not just environmental, it could be other things as well. Rather than trying to get large masses of people together to sort of push something difficult, let's see if we can begin to think creatively with others about where these trim tabs exist. Sometimes people call them the pressure points for change, or the levers, where just a little bit of pressure and focused activity can lead to large change. Now, that trim tab approach is sometimes difficult to enact because you don't really know if you found a trim tab or a lever for change until after the fact. So there are probably going to be some false starts and some failed experiments. But I think my final message would be that coming together with others to think creatively in your community about where a little bit of effort over time can lead to large change, and thinking about why and how that might be the case is going to be far more rewarding and effective than sitting in your house thinking about, should I get a paper bag or a plastic bag or a cloth bag at the market, and in terms of transformation. So there are possibilities out there, and we live in these complex systems in which these openings for change emerge, these emergent sort of possibilities. And my view is that we simply need to be with others in community around issues we care about, supporting one another, maybe a potluck occasionally, maybe some nice drinks on the side, and to be looking, always scanning for these possibilities of trim tab thinking. Because when we find one and we're successful, we can move mountains. But it takes a different part of our brain than the one that is trying to calculate the environmental impact of our latest purchasing decision. So I want to see the citizen trim tab part of the brain expand. We are smart, creative, empathetic species. We can do this, and in the process, we can find greater personal reward at the benefit of the planet.
And thank you, Michael, for this message. It's really been an insightful, a lot of food for thoughts. Sometimes some people will find it challenging. Some people will say, oh, let me reconsider. But that's why we are here. We are giving voice and really give voice to innovators, to people, to authors like you, because we need everybody on board, as you say, to make real change.
Well, thank you, Samuel, for the opportunity to share these thoughts. And if your listeners have further questions or they want to challenge me on any issue, it's oftentimes debate is so helpful. They can find me on the web at michielmaniates.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can just do a quick Google of the Living Green Myth. I'd be happy to answer questions or engage in thoughtful conversation.
And that is fantastic. And that is the way we grow and we share and we learn more. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure and honor hosting you.
Thank you.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.